As the trade war escalates between China and the United States, a book, The American Trap, has caught the eyes of many. Co-authored by Frederic Pierucci, a former executive of French company Alstom, the book is a cautionary tale for today's international trade environment. In April 2013, Pierucci was arrested on corruption charges shortly after his plane touched down in New York. His arrest ran parallel to an acquisition deal secured by an American rival company to swallow Alstom's energy business. Pierucci argues the U.S. is using the extraterritorial reach of U.S. law to take out competition. So what's the bottom line for politically sensitive technological competition of this kind? And how systematic is Washington's use of long-arm jurisdiction to beat down competitors, at least according to him? To find out more, earlier I had an exclusive interview with him and happy to be joined by him through our link in the studio, the author of the book, The American Trap. Let's listen in. Joining us from Paris, Frederic Pierucci, who is a former executive of French firm Alstom, who also co-wrote the book, The American Trap. Frederic, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
Are you surprised that your book is a big hit in the Chinese market?
Well, on one side, I'm a bit surprised because it's not my home country. But on the other hand, you know, I wrote the book in order to alert executives, companies, and politicians about this American trap. So, given the war between the U.S. and China on the economic side, you know, I think a lot of Chinese companies should be aware of what can happen to their employees.
What exactly is the American trap you described in the book?
Well, the American trap is basically the way the U.S. is using the law as an economic weapon to weaken their competitors. So they're using a different kind of laws. I mean, Alstom, for Alstom, my company, they use the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which is a law preventing bribery. On the other side, you know, they use against BNP Paribas, the French bank, and against Huawei and ZTE, another law against American sanctions. So they have an arsenal of different laws that they are using in order to put pressure on companies and to weaken the companies and sometimes to buy those rivals to American companies.
It sounds like you have a lot of resentment against the American extending their internal law to deal with companies that are global. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, basically that's what they're doing. They're using their laws that they impose to the rest of the world. They're making those laws what we say as extraterritorial. That means that it can touch every company, every employee in the world, as long as there is a small link to the U.S. market. So, for instance, you know, all companies who make transactions in U.S. dollar, or all companies who send email who are routed through U.S. server, they consider that those companies are under U.S. law. So even if you make a trade between China and Vietnam, but the contract is in U.S. dollar, the Americans think they have jurisdiction over the companies who are involved in such a transaction. So by doing this, basically, they impose their law to the rest of the world and their vision of the law. And using this to sometime, you know, destabilize big companies who are their rivals.
But on the other hand, some of those that you accuse of trying to exercise American sharp power toward the others are also saying, well, that's because America is the strongest. Therefore, we just do whatever we want and use the tools as we like. How would you respond to them?
That's right. I mean, they are taking advantage of controlling, you know, the internet, of controlling the banking system through the SWIFT, for instance, and using this technological advantage to make an economical advantage out of this. Basically, this started after the end of the Cold War, you know, where they used all the American agencies to focus on economic war and on spying on competitors, like Snowden put it in outside to the world, you know, in 2013. So, of course, they play well. And I'm not angry because they play well. I'm angry because we don't react to this, especially in Europe, because Europe so far has been the main victim of those aggressions. For instance, if you look at the U.S., the companies who have paid more than $100 million fine to the American Treasury for infringing the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which is a law in the U.S. preventing corruption, you realize that only 6 out of 29 companies are Americans, 16 companies are Europeans. So basically they started to apply the law to the American law to Statoil in Norway, to Siemens in Germany, to British Aerospace in the UK, to Alcatel in France, to Alstom in France. And basically, what I'm a little bit angry is the asymmetry of sanctions. Of course, you need to fight corruptions, but the important thing here is to look at the asymmetry of the way they treat their own company and the way they treat foreign companies and foreign people as well.
But what is your suggestion to the European companies, if you like?
Well, of course, I mean, European companies and Chinese companies, they need to be absolutely clear about and have their own process in order to fight corruption. So first of all, they need to align themselves and have the best practices to avoid corruption. That's the first thing. But then, that's not going to be sufficient in order to counterbalance what the U.S. is doing, because one day they use corruption, the other day they use sanctions, tomorrow they use over extraterritorial laws. So we need to react. For instance, 25 years ago, the U.S. did the same thing against European companies, accusing them of forming cartels. Then the European Commission started to put also some big fines to U.S. companies for the same thing. Then there was a balance between Europe and the U.S., and everybody was treating their own company on their side. Now, on the corruption side, we are unable in Europe to do the same thing.
Why?
Each country is trying to react their own way.
Why?
Why? Because now Europe is very fragmented. So the French have started, after the Alstom episode, they have started to enact a law in France to be able to treat the French company who have been doing corruption and to treat those companies in France. The UK have been doing the same thing after the American put a big fine on British Aerospace, but there's not a coordinated approach, if you want. So each country is acting in their own way, because each country has got its own agenda with the US. And since Trump is in power, you know, he's really using bilateral agreements to make sure that there is not a united front in Europe against those legal aggression by the United States.
But then the Europeans seems to be, in a way, exactly falling into that trap, isn't it, using your quote?
Yes, because so far, I can give you just an example. Just in France, you know, French companies have paid since 2010 more than $14 billion fine to the U.S. Treasury for infringing those extraterritorial American laws. So $14 billion, it's a lot of money. But it's only a beginning, because, for instance, in the CAC 40, which regroups all the 40 biggest companies in France, you have 6 companies who have already paid fines, and you have about the same number of companies who are currently under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice. Until we start to apply similar treatment to their companies and to their employees, they will continue to play the same game.
Are you talking about revenge?
What I'm saying is that either we continue like we are, and then the U.S. is going to continue to put big fines on European company and tomorrow on Chinese company, like they have started to do with ZTE and with Huawei, or we start to react. And I think Europe needs to react, China needs to react, otherwise we are going to live in a world basically where the United States decide who should trade with whom, you know, and they will use those laws as weapons to continue to weaken competitors.
When you are talking about these accusations against the U.S., where are your evidence? Or is it conspiracy theory, some would ask?
Well, I think now, first of all, I mean, in the Alstom case, all the evidence are in the book, so and nobody has challenged was evidence so far. Now, with Mr. Trump in power, I think nobody can say it's a conspiracy because he himself put it out loudly. You know, when, for instance, I can give you 2 examples. When Mr. Trump says that he's going to go after European companies who are going to construct the Nord Stream gas pipe between Russia and Germany, they're going to is threatening those companies to pursue them. You know, he makes a clear link between how they're going to use the legal system in order to gain economic advantage. Same thing in the Huawei case, for instance. He said loudly that if he manages to find a deal between China and the U.S., maybe he will do something for Madame Meng, you know, who is currently in Canada. So he himself is putting it outside to the world. So now it's no longer hidden.
I'm sure you personally have gone through a lot during the past years when the case was being brought into the public eyes, when you were accused, when you were put into prison, when you were trying to survive throughout the prison years, and eventually when you came out, saw your friends and relatives and even managed to write this book. Tell me what kind of process rather it is for you personally, from the very beginning of this saga until today. Frederic.
Well, it's difficult to give you a short answer to this, but basically, I started to write the book the first day I went to jail, because the first day I went to jail, I started to write a diary to look at what was happening to me.
Where were you serving at the time?
Not to forget it.
Which prison were you serving at the time?
At that time, they put me in a high security prison in Rhode Island. You have 4 levels of security in a U.S. prison, and they put me directly in the highest level of security. And they threatened me to 15 to 19 years in prison if I was not pleading guilty. So at the end of the day, I pled guilty because they told me that if you plead guilty, you're going to be released in 6 months. So I started to write, and I started to read all the FCPA cases of companies, of employees, in order to understand the law, because I could not rely on my lawyer to defend myself. So I studied this in depth. I spent 8 hours a day during 14 months just to read the cases, to make analyses, and to try to find things in the previous cases that could help my case.
The French company and the French government did not come out to save you, or at least to speak on your behalf. And the French people did not do that either. So many wonder whether you were treated, as you said in the book, unfairly and illegally, or actually you, unfortunately, if I could be frank here, deserve what you had, some would wonder. Frederic, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, of course. At that time, you had one minister who understood what was happening. This was Arnaud Montebourg, who was the Minister of Economic, and he clearly made the link between the purchase of Alstom by General Electric and the cases against Alstom in the U.S. There have been an investigation also in France by the Parliament about this, and you can read yourself the conclusion. So a lot of people in France realized, but realized far too late, about the trap in which Alstom fell.
But why were they realizing, in your words, too late at that time?
Because before Alstom, you had several companies who went through this. You had Total, Technip, Alcatel.
Hi, Beijing. You want my
every
audio?
time the company managed to make a deal with the United States and sign a plea agreement
first of all,
and pay a big
the focus is on African women and their
headline.
empowerment.
What was
He
different
announced
about
his new,
Alstom is that basically
his new
Alstom
cabinet. South Africa's
not
president.
only pay a check, but then was basically sold out.
Thanks.
That's right.
to
Alex
General Electric.
or Lucia
And,
or somebody.
Alstom basically, if you
The
know
teleprompter.
the company basically is involved in power generation. So Alstom has built all the nuclear steam turbine for the French nuclear power plants. Cool. So basically, by selling Alstom to General Electric, we have lost control of a very sovereign industry, which is the steam turbine for nuclear power plants. So. Which is a big problem here in France, where when you know that 75% of the electricity is produced by nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
So that this loss of sovereignty in a very key industry made a lot of people react, and now people understand that we have lost something, and it made the headline. And now we know that the next target is Airbus, which is also a big flagship here in France. So people understand now that there is a necessity to react, and the French reacted. I mean, after the Alstom case, we enacted a new French anti-corruption law, enabling French companies to be able to settle their case in France rather than waiting for the U.S. to come in and to basically do the job instead of the French doing their job, on this. So we've seen the first reaction in France. First of all, for instance, last year, Société Générale was under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice also for bribery in Libya. The French managed to at least get half of the fine paid in France instead of 100% of the fine paid in the U.S. So that was the first success. But we need to do more of this, and each country needs to treat its own problem and not the U.S. treat the problem of their own companies.
What have you learned personally throughout that period of time?
I'm not anti-American. For instance, I would not be here if 2 Americans didn't put their own house to free myself out of prison. Because they put their own house as a collateral on the bail package, so that I could get out. So what I'm against is really the government. They are using the law under moral value that nobody can dispute, but the twist was moral value in order to help their own companies.
You earlier mentioned about ZTE and Huawei, 2 Chinese global companies. Of course, they have different fates, and Huawei is an ongoing story. Mr. Pierucci, how do you really see the nature of that story? Is there any advice or experience you would like to share with your colleagues from the Huawei company?
Well, obviously, I don't know the case in detail because I have no access to the indictment and so on. But what you can see is that there is a very similarity in the way that the U.S. Department of Justice is approaching this. Basically, in order to put pressure on the company, they arrest or they indict somebody close to the top of the company. So what is happening to Mrs. Meng is very similar to what happened to me. Now, on the Alstom side, the clear goal was to buy out the company and to control basically all the nuclear power plant in France. On the Huawei side, it's more to stop a competitor who has a big advantage in a unique technology, which is the 5G technology, which is the technology of the future.
Frederic Pierucci, thank you so much for sharing your stories.